Seated to my right from you is Mr. Jean-Pierre who is the Vice President of Sales worldwide for Newtec, which is one of the more innovative technology companies in this space and is pushing out personalization along with a lot of other technologies. Jean-Pierre, could you just take a moment and tell us very briefly about Newtec so that we have a context for this conversation?
Sure, Robert. Good morning, everybody. Well, yes, in a couple of sentences, what Newtec is all about. Well, first of all, we are an equipment vendor. We're not a service provider, and we're dedicated 100% to the satellite industry. So we are very much a satellite-based company. We have a pretty wide product portfolio. I'm not gonna go into that. We're not here to make publicity. We're here to basically go into the topic of broadband and TV. But in general, Newtec has been active for the last 25 years in making equipment for the broadcast industry right from its conception. We're into the modulator business. So we help to provide TV both in the distribution part but also in the contribution part. So contributing TV content over satellite and distributing it has been one of our core bread and butter businesses for, as I said, for the last 20 years. More recently, for the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've also been moving into the pure data domain and more particularly the broadband domain. So we have developed and have been very successful over the last couple of years in offering broadband satellite services over satellite. So in multiple instances, we do have offered, and SES Astra is our biggest customer still in Europe nowadays, and we've managed to ship over 100,000 terminals, which allow end users to use satellite for broadband services. So not only for DTH, I think satellite has been pretty well known as a technology for DTH to provide TV content to the end user. It does allow, by adding a return channel, to offer broadband services over the same technology. So in those two domains, Newtec has been rather active for the last couple of decades.
Thank you. And not seated next to him is David Waldick of AdJuggler. We've done our best to track him down. David, if you're out there somewhere, we'd love to hear from you. But in the meantime, we're going to go on because I think what Jean-Pierre just said is interesting. His company is in those two spaces, right? They're in DTH, traditional television distribution, and they're also in broadband distribution. What we're going to be talking about is the place where they begin to intersect. Specifically, about personalization, because once you add that back channel, that ability to get information as well as deliver information, things change. And so in the next few minutes, we're going to be talking about IP-based interaction on the television set. It promises an expanding range of on-demand, of transactional, and multi-screen experiences for viewers. So how are we doing? What's the state of play? What does our experience to date tell us about these services in the future? What are the technology and the supply chain innovations that are going to be necessary to make this brave new world work? So, Jean-Pierre, let's talk a little bit about right now what's happening today in terms of viewer interaction with the television set, whether it's directly just on that television set or if it's on the other screens that increasingly are entering the living room.
Yeah. Well, it's a very interesting question, and unfortunately, there's no general truth, I would say. Right. There's no global statement that becomes true for every culture, for every geographical region you can think about. So, and I think there's two dimensions that immediately jump into my mind, and the first dimension is age groups. I think it's in every culture the case that we see huge differences in how interactivity is being experienced by the end user depending on the ages. If I compare, the person that I know best is myself, I guess. The way I look at television and the way I interact with my TV set is fundamentally different than how my children deal with it, and is even or as fundamentally different as my parents deal with it. And I think the success of the industry and the success of the service providers and the content providers is to tap into that diversity of that public. And the key is indeed to be able to use as many generic technologies that allow you to tap into those different age groups. When I look again, if I compare the way my children, well, I call them children, and the youngest is 20, the way they look television is fundamentally different. They tend to use multiple technologies at the same time, which I find I might be getting old, but I find it quite challenging and interesting to see, because we conceptually we're watching TV, and we tend to focus, our age group at least, we tend to focus on one particular thing going on at the same time, and then we can talk about the technology behind it. The age groups of today, they tend to use parallel technologies at the same time. He's watching TV on his iPad, while God forbid they would not miss anything happening on their chat rooms, and in the background he listens to linear TV and tells me what to start recording in terms of video on demand. So it's a very, very wide perception that is there. And that's one dimension. The second dimension is definitely geographical. The way people watch TV here in the US, for example, is fundamentally different than it is in India, to use one example. And the technologies behind it are quite different too. But I think the only global trend in terms of technology is that IPTV is picking up speed. And there is still growth in the DTH market. Thank God for companies such as Newtec. Cable definitely is, of course, one of the biggest well-endorsed technologies, and we see interactivity coming up in all three of them. While IPTV, historically speaking, has been very interactive right from the start. So to come back to your question, there's no general truth in it, but you can definitely pinpoint some tendencies on the different levels.
Talk a little bit about the difference between, you gave a specific example, US television viewing and Indian television viewing. How are those different?
Well, it is different in a sense of, historically speaking, linear TV, we all know about it. And if I look at a company or a country or a market such as India, is being more, or has been traditionally, slightly more conservative, and it still is today. Again, their IPTV is relatively small in terms of market penetration. There's hardly any IPTV. It's picking up now gradually. So people are not used to the aspect of interactivity. I don't seem to be missing it. There's no huge market demand. If I look at the take rate of IPTV, it's not picking up. So there seems to be no market pull into this type of applications. While on the other hand, it's a well-developed country. You can't say that it's, at least for TV, a non-developed country. But there seems to be no push. Nobody is convinced that it's really needed, or there is not enough market pull. And that is, I think, quite fundamentally different from what is going on in the US market. Why that is hard to tell, because technology is there and there seems to be quite some difference. So it must be driven by content or by other historical or cultural reasons, which I'm at least personally not familiar with, but it can't be the technology, it's something else.
I know about Bharti Airtel, which is their largest mobile carrier, a couple of years ago went into DTH, and they built themselves a platform that enabled them to do just about anything, IPTV, mobile video, whatever it might be, but their business plan said, we're just doing DTH. So it's the same thing you're just talking about. They're waiting for that opportunity. Yeah,
and again, the way interactivity is being experienced today is quite different than it is 4 or 5 years ago. I remember BSkyB in the UK, another DTH provider, also started with interactive services. And it was basically using the telephone, the PSTN, as return path. Newtec, by the way, in the meantime has developed a system which allows for interactivity over satellite. So the return path can nowadays also go over satellite with still very affordable end-user equipment. But to come back to that question, back then the technology already existed, but it was never successful. BSkyB actually wasn't successful at all 4 years ago with that interactivity return channel over satellite. It probably had a lot to do with the technology itself and the fact that the end user had to pay on his telephone bill for the return path. So every time he was doing a televoting or what type of application over DTH, actually it increased the telephone bill. So people didn't like that concept. And it probably prohibited the take-on of a lot of those interactive applications. Nowadays it's completely different. So with IPTV and interactive cable being well endorsed in most of the countries, people know it. In the end, it still gets on your bill. A lot of those applications are not for free. but it becomes less visible and people are more familiar with it.
Okay, so we talked about a few years ago. Let's polish up our crystal ball and look a few years ahead. Now that we have IP-connected televisions coming into the homes, although that's still pretty new, how do you at Newtec expect that to be changing the viewer's experience of their television?
It's again a very apart from the fact that we don't have a crystal ball within Newtec, it's a very tough question. I think it relates again to how well endorsed those applications are going to be, because in the end, whether we like it or not, we as technology providers are there to support the applications where we don't drive the market. So it's very difficult to look forward there, and it's more content-driven, I believe, rather exclusive content-driven question than anything else. So it's very hard for us to predict. I think from what we see in the market, again, no general truths which are valid on a global scale, but the applications that seems to be driven to, I would call narrowcast applications that are basically targeting a particular market segment or again a particular age group. I think those, what we see in a lot of those markets are probably the ones that are most inclined to be successful. Again, technology is very wide. So you need to basically focus on specific age groups, specific cultural contents. I think that'll be what we see in the market being most successful.
Now, of course, the user experience is only one part of it. Behind that user experience is a archipelago of technology implementations that are currently all designed to push content one way. Mm-hmm. And so, as a technologist, what changes do you expect to see in the distribution system, both terrestrial and satellite, that are going to be necessary to enable true personalization of content from advertising or programming? And where are we right now, you think, in that evolution?
Well, the personal or the TV has become indeed very personal, as I said, and definitely within the age groups that I've described earlier. We seem to be in a society more driven by individual needs than anything else. So from a technological point of view, I believe that on the short term, those technologies that succeed in bringing content as cheap as possible to the individual rather than a broad spectrum of users are going to be most successful.
And that's a sea change in media. Mm-hmm. Right, as opposed to the mass audience, you're talking about a drastically different
Absolutely.
vision.
And once you start thinking about satellite, definitely, because by definition, satellite is a broadcast medium. You send it out once and it can be received by millions of people. You basically can't predict and you don't care how many people receive it because mm-hmm. you only send it out once. And that's where the challenge is going to be for satellite. So how do you turn that to your advantage is the question, because intuitively you would say, as the medium or the way people watch TV becomes so individual, is there still a future for broadcast, which by definition is equal for everybody? Well, I believe there is, also from a technology point of view. Coming back again, satellite, you can still use it for broadcast applications and broadband applications under the one single condition is you need the return channel. Because when you want to do narrowcast or you want to do downloads of movies to set-top boxes where, again, the user can on demand go and get what he wants is another application. You can broadcast and download the full content during the night, for example, to a set-top box. And then during the day, the user can actually start looking and watch whatever he wants, whenever he wants. And because that seems to be, of course, the direction we're heading to, users decide themselves on a very individual basis what they want to see at a particular point in time. And the key from a technology point of view, for satellite at least, is to have that return path. And I don't want to become too technical too, but when the question comes, what is going to drive the business case, profitability for the provider is definitely a key driver. Mm-hmm. And satellite is being faced with one challenge, and that is piracy, which is not the case for IPTV or other type of cable technologies. And it steals away a lot of revenue from the provider. To give you an idea, well, it's an estimate. Nobody knows what the impact of piracy is for satellite, but in Asia, for example, it's estimated to be $2 billion in 2010.
Was that billion with a B?
Billion with a B, okay. Indeed. And there's an estimate that for every paying customer, there's at least 3 of them. The Middle East is a good example with Orbit that claims that for every paying user, there's 3 users that actually don't pay. Now, of course, you can imagine those other 3 probably wouldn't be users if they would have to pay for it. So you can't say that getting rid of piracy would triple the revenue. That would be kind of too simple. But having a controlled way of dealing with piracy is something that nowadays is also available over satellite, again, due to the fact that the return path is there. So to cut a long story short, yes, even if TV has become more individualized and people tend to expect that they can watch whatever they want, whenever they want, doesn't exclude satellite technology and doesn't exclude any other type of technology. Again, I don't think it's driven by the technology, it's driven by the applications and how the content is being distributed.
Just if anybody wants to get into this conversation, please put your hand up and we'll bring you in. I want to stay on satellite for a minute. You're talking about satellite broadcast, we're delivering one-to-many, and now we're entering a world of interactivity. And what are some of the technology models that allow me to decide that I want to watch the last episode of Charlie Sheen, whoever ever appearing on 1.5 Men now over satellite? What do I have to? How do I make that happen in a world in which it's really one-to-many?
It's not an easy thing to deal with because, as I said, and you mentioned it yourself, it's by default the technology that allows you to broadcast linear TV, and that's how it was historically born. The example I gave earlier, download during off-peak hours,
Sure.
A lot of content, predefined content. So it's not well. The example you gave is that you can think of anything and you want to see that anything at that particular point in time. That drives you back to the big ugly internet in most of the cases. So having access to the internet for that type of paying or non-paying content, for that matter, is the key. So it's no longer the good old traditional cable that comes into your home. It immediately reverts back to having access to the big ugly, as I call it.
The big ugly?
The big ugly internet to have access to that content. And that is definitely not excluded in doing that over satellite.
But it's a whole different distribution channel. And I know that you're neither a program creator nor do you run a channel or do you advertise, but just looking forward, what do you foresee as being some of the impacts of a world in which we're going to see what we want, when we want it, as opposed to, for the issue of programmers, of channels that provide, have a brand, provide programming, and for advertisers?
It's definitely a content question, which is for me personally hard to deal with, Robert. To be honest, I find it very hard to predict. Looking back at a lot of those applications that we see nowadays, nobody, or I know very little people who actually predicted that a couple of years ago. So looking into the future from a content point of view is very difficult. So I don't know, perhaps afterwards the audience can comment on it and see if there's anybody that can contribute to that discussion, but I find it a very tough one.
Well, I'll give you a specific example. I'm a niche. Boy, am I a niche. I decided I'm not a sports fan particularly. So about 2 months ago, I thought, I'm just not watching any commercial television. So I did it. I cut the cord, and now I consume, television when I want it. What interests me about this is that you begin to become a downloader as opposed to come on, what's it called when you start, you're checking out and you see an impulse buyer. Instead of being an impulse buyer, I'm a downloader. So you begin to accustom your life to, I want to watch this tonight, so I'm going to start it now. Mm-hmm. It's a completely different medium from just sitting down and turning on the television because you don't currently have anything else going on in your life. The loyalty is much higher.
Yeah, and again, a lot of that shifts, as I said, impulse buying is indeed a good example. I think everybody agreed that a couple of years ago it was considered to be the Valhalla. A lot of pay TV providers were counting on the fact that the impulse buyers would bring a lot of extra revenue which didn't used to be there. And in most of the cases they were right. And looking at IPTV, definitely in Europe, any predictions and forecasts on additional revenues for those providers based on pay TV have been doubled. So everybody underestimated that. So it's a kind of a strange phenomenon because I would think, or I kind of thought that would be rather on the decline due to the download mentality. If again, coming back to the age groups, if I would ask my son if he would think it was logic that you pay for your content, or that if he were to be prepared to spend a part of, even the smallest part of his pocket money or salary on actually buying that content, he would think that I was crazy. Why I myself, I find it perfectly logical to pay for something that I decide to view online. So again, a lot of differences in function of the cultural and age backgrounds, and I don't think there's any general truth to be told on that one.
Well, I'd like to thank you. We've been listening to Jean-Pierre de Muyt, who's the Vice President of Sales worldwide for a company called Newtec based in Belgium, which is a provider of some of the leading edge technology in the television business. I appreciate your time, Jean-Pierre. I appreciate your time. Don't go away. In 4 minutes, we're going to be hearing a session called Who Wins When Video Goes Mobile. So thank you very much.